Good morning and welcome to AEI. I'm very excited to welcome you all here for a really interesting discussion on ethnographic research, which is part of a new study that we're proposing at AEI with a bunch of really smart economists, sociologists, and other policy experts. This is a brand new research area for us, for many of us, including myself. I remember, a couple of years back going to Robert Dorr and saying, I really want to study families more in depth and, ask them deeper questions that go beyond questionnaires. And he was like, well, I think you want to do an ethnographic study. And that's when it sort of, exposed me to the idea of ethnographic research and looking at the studies that have already been done by so many sort of trailblazers in this area. So what we did over the course of the previous year was to include many of the people who've done a lot of this good work, and people like Kathy Eden and others who've sort of been trailblazers in this area of ethnographic research, studying and documenting and answering many questions that a lot of us have but are unable to answer through traditional sort of research methods, but also included many other fantastic policy and academic experts who have done tremendous work on poverty, on work, on opioid addiction, on the role of family structure in in affecting economic outcomes. And so we, a lot of us, a bunch of us got together and said, if we had to do an ethnographic study, what would it look like? What are the missing data pieces in our different research areas that we would like to answer? And the product of that is the report that we're releasing today. We have an electronic version that we will email all of you, but we're also going to be printing some copies in case it's of interest. But the real idea, it's called the American Family Diaries project, and it will talk a lot about barriers to opportunity and especially barriers to work. What is it that's really holding people back from accessing things that a lot of us talk about all the time? So very often, when we're sitting in DC, we have very blanket solutions to problems. We see, low-income households, and we say, well, let's expand the EITC. Let's talk about job training. Let's talk about education. Let's talk about, getting people back into the workforce. And a lot of times, we don't really understand why people are not taking advantage of, all the stuff that we talk about all the time. What is really holding people back? So this project is sort of an exploration of those, the behind-the-scenes conversations that families have that stops them from sort of moving forward and, taking advantage of that job training program of, going out there and looking for work. What is it that's sort of not captured in traditional household surveys that we could get at through ethnographic research by actually going into these families, letting them speak instead of asking, instead of us asking questions, letting them come up with the solutions and coming up with, telling us about their conversations. So here is a brief run of show. I will first present our proposal. This was over the course of the previous year, we sort of, as I said, sat down and came up with a broad outline of what we want to work on. We would welcome your input. This is obviously, we're starting off this project, so we're very much in the stage of requiring and asking people for comments, suggestions, help along the way. And then I'm going to turn to Robert Moffett and Robert Dorr to explain in more detail our proposal, why we chose the target population that we chose, why we are asking the questions that we plan to ask. And then we will have a broader discussion of the pros and cons of ethnographic research with Jennifer Silva, Bruce Meyer, and Brad Wilcox. Before I begin, let me give you a quick introduction to our fantastic panelists. So we have Robert Moffett. Robert is the Krieger Eisenhower Professor of Economics at Johns Hopkins University's Krieger School of Arts and Sciences. He also holds a joint appointment at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. Robert Dorr is the Morgridge Fellow in Poverty Studies at AEI, where he studies and evaluates how free enterprise and improved federal policies and programs can reduce poverty and provide opportunities for vulnerable Americans. Bruce Meyer is a visiting scholar at AEI, where he focuses on poverty, inequality, and social safety net programs. Concurrently, he is the McCormick Foundation Professor at the University of Chicago's Harris School of Public Policy. Jennifer Silva is an assistant professor of sociology at Bucknell University. Before teaching at Bucknell, she was a postdoctoral fellow at the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. And last but not least, Brad Wilcox is a visiting scholar at AEI, where he directs the Home Economics Project. Inaugurated in the fall of 2013, the research project explores the links between family structure and economic growth in 20 countries around the world. He's also an associate professor in the Department of Sociology at the University of Virginia. So let me begin briefly with an introduction to ethnographic research and our discussions over the course of the previous year. So what is ethnographic research? Ethnographic research is really qualitative research that can aim to provide a better understanding of the motivations, the behaviors and challenges that families can face, that households face. It's very similar. So when you look at it as an economist, yeah, there's a lot of similarity with traditional survey methods. But the advantage, I think, of ethnographic research and qualitative research is that you sort of move beyond asking a preset design, set of questions, and the interviews can be more open-ended. They can be more exploratory. They can be more, tell us what you think is, stopping you from doing X, Y, and Z, what's holding you back from claiming, food stamps or TANF. It's more in-depth. You can go, it's a smaller sample, I think, to begin with, and then you can do more in-depth and targeted interviews. It can be combined, and I think this is one of the new things that we're hoping to do with our project, is to really combine that qualitative information with quantitative information from administrative data sets. And I think Bruce is going to talk a little bit about, how often when people report that they're getting advantage or they're taking certain federal benefits or programs, how does that match up? How does that square with what we see in the administrative data? So there are often gaps, and that's one of the sort of advantages, I think, of our project, where we're going to try to combine both types of methods. We have a few prime examples we cite a lot in our report, but I'm going to highlight some of them here. Kathy Eden, who is part of our working group, has done a ton of research into looking at studies that aim to understand the situation of single mothers, of low-income mothers on welfare, who try to talk about children born out of wedlock. Why are women marrying out of wedlock? Why are they not going into traditional marriages and then having children? I think we've uncovered a ton of sort of interesting ideas and understanding of how people actually think, how they behave, why they, how they view marriage and so on as a result of her work. Matthew Desmond's Evicted is another example that we've seen recently, which tracks homeless people over time, their struggle as they are moved and moved out of homes, how they deal with the lack of homes, how they access shelters and so on. It talks a lot about issues of incarceration, dependence on food banks, churches, and the hardships that come with living in poverty. We have Murdoch and Schneider's research that talks a lot about the financial situation of families. Again, very in-depth, sort of, trying to do something more than, what does your income statement look like once a year or once in 6 months, but really what is the struggle on a day-to-day basis for these families that don't have enough to make basic ends meet. And I was looking at economists who have done ethnographic research, and I came across, Steve Levitt and Venkatesh's study of people and children growing up in public housing projects in Chicago, and how, a lot of them became gang members, and, it provided us an insight into sort of the economic situation and the economic outcomes for gang members versus non-gang members. Again, you could not imagine doing that kind of stuff or having access to that kind of a sample with traditional research methods, traditional survey questions. And so I think there's a whole potential role of ethnography in answering previously unexplored questions. And I think Jennifer has done tremendous work with Robert Putnam in their book, Our Kids, talking about how children growing up in different families and different economic situations, how parenting styles differ, how they have access to different kinds of resources and so on. So as part of the American Family Diaries working group, as I said, we have a bunch of scholars, experts who have been looking at various interesting policy issues. So, what are the barriers to work for able-bodied adults? How are people trying to get access to better jobs? How are people supplementing incomes? A lot of the stuff is missing in traditional, let's say, current population survey data. Are people actually that poor? Are they supplementing incomes in ways that go unreported in these traditional data sets? How do we measure poverty? Do marginal tax rates matter? What is the effect of the opioid crisis, on families? So we initially started off by sort of just looking at our different research areas and saying, where are the gaps in our knowledge? What is it within our fields that we would like to get answered through the use of ethnographic research? And we understand that, ethnographic research is not, it's not may or may not deliver on all of these promises, but it's really, is it worth exploring? And so when we started identifying the barriers to opportunity, these are some of the barriers that we came up with. We talk about a lack of education, lack of access to, or problems with job training programs, regulatory barriers, criminal, history of criminal incarceration, tax rates, child support payments that are tied to income, opioids and drug abuse, work schedules, and so on. So, and then we said, okay, what's the populations group, what's the target population that we would like to study? And we honed in, and Robert Dorr and Robert Moffat will talk a little bit about why. The why of why we chose this population, but we decided to focus on able-bodied adults without dependence, who we can track through the SNAP program, so through the food stamps programs. ABODs are adults between the ages of 18 and 49 who do not have a physical or mental disability, who do not have dependence, but they're still not in the workforce. When you interview them in the SNAP data, they're reporting no earnings. And they're applying for food stamps. To qualify for SNAP, they're required to work at least 20 hours a week or participate in a qualified job training program. And the reason we also focused on SNAP is that they're often the focus of discussion. We had a recent bill or at least a discussion around expanding the work requirements that were being applied to ABODs. And so they're often, talked about, and yet I think we have a limited understanding of just, again, what's holding them back? What's the barrier to work? What's the barrier to opportunity for these adults? So many of the barriers that we identified earlier, including lack of education, problems with job training programs, criminal histories, etc., could be applied to them. So we think that it's an interesting area of study. You also find that ABODs are sort of the least likely to have access to government benefits. I think because they're able-bodied adults, they're able to work, they have no dependence. The system is very sort of skewed against giving them benefits. And so in this context, sort of doing an ethnographic research project that's centered on ABODs seemed to make sense to us. We would love your comments on that. At the same time, I also want to be mindful of the fact that there are problems with ethnographic research, and I know Jennifer will talk about them. She's been doing some of that work herself. But there could be selection bias. So again, we're not talking about a large random sample like we tend to do in economics. We're not trying to make this truly representative. We're saying we really are targeting a very specific population. We're probably talking about 30 to 40 or 50 families being interviewed. And so, is there selection bias? Are we selecting people who we think are most likely to fit our preconceived notions of how people are, behave? So that's something we need to be careful of. There's attrition bias, the fact that we're targeting such few families, and then it's very likely, especially if the population itself is not very stable, has unstable histories or whatever, work histories and so on, that it's very difficult to continuously track them even for a year. There's the Hawthorne effect, which is that if that family knows that they're being studied and they're being interviewed, that they may behave differently than they would under other circumstances if they were not actually being the object of study. And then there's objectivity. Do we get driven by the stories? Do we sort of accept everything that's being told to us and report it, or do we are we likely to get more subjective data? Are we likely to get biased by that? How does that influence our thinking? How objective can we stay as part of the project? And then replicability and generalization. Can somebody go back and replicate the results? That's often not possible with ethnographic research because the families may not want to be interviewed, they may not want to be identified. So these are some of the issues that we are hoping to be much more careful about going forward. And now I want to sort of open up the discussion if the two Roberts can come on stage. And so, that will give you an opportunity to ask questions about, why we decided to focus on this group and how we plan to move forward and how to be careful about some of the stuff that we're talking about here. So Robert, I'm going to begin with you, Robert Hoffman.
Okay. Happy to be here. Let me turn on my timer here so I can watch. Happy to be here and be a part of the project, and I've enjoyed over the past year having discussions with a partner and the whole team about using ethnographic research to address a lot of issues facing the low-income population that I feel we don't understand well and which have very strong relevance to policy. I want to say, first of all, just a matter of terms. Often these ethnographic style methodologies are called qualitative studies. One of my pet peeves about that is that if you really read what ethnographers do, there's a lot of quantitative work in it. If you go back to Catherine Eden's first book with the Making Ends Meet, which Aparna referred to, that book was about making ends meet. Well, that's a very economic kind of the title. You have income and you have needs. How are you making ends meet? Her whole book is talking to families about all the sources of income. How much you receive from this? How much you receive from this? And what did you spend it on? What did you spend it on? She has tables of all their sources of income and all their sources of expenditure. Very quantitative. So I want to make sure that's understood. And just speaking very generally, I think of this qualitative work, or what we're calling ethnography, as mainly an opportunity to spend a lot of time with families over a long period of time and just kind of a conversation with them rather than only 2 hours and just ask a few questions. You can learn more spending 30 hours with somebody than you can with 2 hours. And I'm a quantitative person. I've only done survey research. And I know that you can't have a survey more than 2 or 3 hours, or they just get bored and they start answering and said, no, yes, 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 and they want you to get out of there. And you just have a very limited amount of time. And as a quantitative researcher, I get very frustrated by that because you only have a set of questions and you can't really answer. They're all very cut and dried because you're trying to have uniformity and you can't really explore the reasons for things. So I'm a very big supporter of ethnographic research, even though I'm mostly a consumer of it. I read it avidly. I worked on projects with ethnographers, but I'm a quantitative person who is a consumer of it. I've never actually done one myself, but I've found great insights. I read every ethnography I have time to read. And now I want to give 2 examples of where I've learned something from ethnographies that are very policy relevant to me because I'm a very policy-oriented person. And then I'm going to say a couple of things about our barriers to opportunity and why I think we can learn more from this kind of ethnographic study. 2 examples. One is going way back, Catherine Eden's co-authored study on Making Ends Meet with Laura Line, which is featured prominently in our report, Making Ends Meet. What did we learn from that? We learned that this was back in the AFDC area, and it was mostly single mothers and in different states. And she found that there was a huge amount of unreported income, that they were supplementing their AFDC benefits with all kinds of income. There was work off the books, there was earnings, there was help from boyfriends, there was illegal income, all kinds of income. And they were using that to, quote unquote, make ends meet. In other words, here what I really need money for my food, my clothing, my housing, I've got to supplement it. We could never have gotten that information from any survey I've ever been associated with. And most of that income is not in administrative data either, so administrative is not going to get to. There's only one way to get that, and that's talking to people periodically and finding out what they're really getting their income from. I don't know any other way to get that kind of data. It's interesting, too, that she had different states, and she found that in states with low AFDC benefits, people were much more likely to supplement than in high benefits. It's like they had a target. Here's what I need to support my family and my children, and if the AFDC benefits go up to that, I'm going to go doing something else and get some more income. It just depends on the AFDC. So I thought that was very interesting. The other example I'll mention is the book also that Aparna mentioned, a recent book by Jonathan Morduck and Rachel Schneider on financial diaries. I think that's a very interesting book from the point of view of the Matthew Desmond book on eviction. Why do people get evicted so much? Why are they not paying the rent? If you read the Morduck and Schneider book, what's going on is other things are happening in their lives that require money. And they document that most of these low-income families have a car, which is a very low-quality car. It breaks down. They need $150, $200 to get it fixed. They got to get it fixed. And if they don't get it fixed, they're going to lose their job. And it's either that or the rent. Well, they don't pay the rent. And they tell the landlord next month. Most of them are, if they're covered by private health insurance, they have these really bad plans, which are very high deductibles. And every time they have an event, they've got to spend, for their kids or themselves, another $200 to go to the doctor or have some medical procedure or drugs because their plans are so bad. What are they going to do? They're not going to pay the rent. And they don't pay the rent, or they go try to borrow money from families and friends, and it's very complicated to do that because there are all kinds of personal relationships and, your family. Then you're in debt to them, kind of not only money-wise, but kind of, family reasons. But they're making a rational choice. I'm not going to pay the rent. I have to do this. And they're taking a chance, and they're very aware that the chance is that if they don't do that in long enough, they're going to get evicted. But I got to do what I have to do. I have a certain amount of money. And again, never could have gotten that from a survey. Never could have gotten that from administrative data. Ethnographic, it was very revealing. So on our project, Barriers to Opportunity, I'm a quantitative person. I actually divide them up into two subcategories. One is barriers to current work. Why aren't people working? And the second one is barriers to mobility. Why aren't people taking advantage of things to improve their situation? And as a quantitative person, I actually see puzzles out there in the quantitative work about both of those. On the why don't people work, we don't really understand yet still why the labor force participation rate has been declining for 20 years for women and even longer than 20 years for men. We have a very crude grasp of that, all kinds of hypotheses out there. We don't really understand it. It's especially true, puzzling to me, because at the bottom, if you talk about welfare programs, at the very bottom, because of the earned income tax credit and the child tax credit today, the marginal tax rates are very low. Say from not working up to about $10,000 or $15,000, you face a negative marginal rate. You can get a lot of money out of the earned income tax credit. And H&R Block is making low-income families very aware that they can make some money by working. The high marginal tax rates come like $15,000 to $20,000 and up. Then you face some really high ones. But we're talking about people who aren't working at all. Why aren't they taking advantage of these low marginal tax rates? I don't really understand why it is. And upon our list of all kinds of reasons that might be health, might be education, maybe the jobs are terrible and they don't see them as worth taking. I really don't think we understand that very well. And the barriers to social mobility, as economists, labor economists like me have documented that the rate of return, I'll use the economic word of that, to high school is tremendous between being a high school dropout and a high school degree. But we still have like 7, 8, 9% of kids who aren't, completing high school. Why not? I'm a rational economist. Why aren't they making this calculation? Why don't they see it? Why aren't they engaged in training programs? 4-year college is a little bit different. I understand that many of these students either don't see that as an opportunity or maybe it's difficult to do. And maybe the 2-year colleges aren't always the high quality. But there are lots of puzzles there. Why aren't they taking advantage of the opportunities that are there? is that they don't understand it, they don't get it, they don't perceive that that rate of return is there, that they not have information from their families or their neighborhoods, or is it they don't have the money? Maybe high school, that shouldn't be a barrier to high school. The taxpayers are paying for that. But it might be barriers to going a little bit higher to a junior college that charges $5,000 a year. I don't think we understand that. And I don't see any a route to using survey or administrative data to answer those questions in a satisfactory way and to find out why people are doing. And both of those topics on barriers to opportunity, to me, are great opportunities for ethnographic work to go talk to people, find out how they perceive things, document the reality of what are your costs of work here, what would be the tuition if you went to junior college, do they know it, and use that to think about new policies that can both increase employment and increase upward mobility.
Great, thanks, Robert.
So, Aparna, thank you very much for allowing me to participate in this exercise, and especially for bringing people like Robert Moffat to join us as well. It's been a great experience of helping an economist learn how to do an ethnography study, and we've all tried hard to participate in that, and I think we're making progress, and it's great that we're about to launch it into the field. But I do want to, and I come from not the academic world, I'm a former administrator and practitioner, and these kinds of efforts were something that were very common to us in New York City Human Resources Administration, which was an agency that had the largest public assistance programs under us. And we were able to talk to people all the time, and we sent our evaluators and our researchers into the offices to talk to people in greater length than what would show up in a survey necessarily, and find out what is the attitude toward the child support enforcement program of custodial and non-custodial parents. Why do some people apply for and receive food stamp benefits and others don't? And we learned things about there were reasonable, rational reasons why individuals, for a variety of reasons, would decline to seek various forms of assistance that weren't entirely the fault of the agency. And we also learned a lot about childcare choices. If you talk to parents of young children who are low income and you ask them, we have high quality subsidized childcare here, we have a voucher here, which you can use to have your relative or friend or informal care, we got good reasons why they would decline the opportunity of the high quality formal care and instead use the voucher for their family members. So we learn things inside the agency, and so I'm supportive of these kinds of efforts for similar reasons that Robert just mentioned. You learn more detail. Having said that, I may want to maybe jumping a little ahead on the next panel, but I do want to caution that these sort of studies do need to be looked at with some careful caution and skepticism. Because one thing, and this is going to sound like the typical line of a former welfare administrator, guess what? People don't always tell the truth. So I have a sort of view about this that do trust but verify. And one of the great things about this study that we're doing is we're linking the ethnographic study, the intense, detailed, over a long period of time, and by the way, these studies are hard. They take a lot of effort, and with administrative data to verify some of the information that the recipients or participants tell us. The other issue is objectivity of the interviewers. Some ethnography studies rely on trusted intermediaries. I love trusted intermediaries, but sometimes they're maybe not completely objective about their attitudes towards the issues facing the individuals they're talking to. So I look a little carefully at participants in these sorts of studies that come from community groups that are active in various forms of political activism or support for low-income families. I'm not sure they're always as objective as they should be, and we need to be cautious about that. I've already mentioned administrative data. We need to know when someone says, I only get X in SNAP benefits or I only got Y in cash welfare or child care assistance. We really want to know, for that individual, what did the agency say in their records were the recipients' amounts available, because they're not always correct. And I'm very glad that we're doing that. There's a lot there. But there are other sources of information which I'm not sure we will be able to get to, but need to be considered. And that would be employers, recipients and beneficiaries, or people in low-income communities often say things about their previous work situation. I lost my job. I was fired. I worked really hard. I did everything right, and they still let me go. They changed my schedule. They're all very plausible things. They could have happened, but it would be interesting to know what does the employer say about all of that. Family members. Often people talk about their interactions with other family members, and they all, that's their perspective, but we are all family members, right? We all know that our family members may have slightly different perspective about what's happened in our own life. And I think that sometimes we don't do enough to verify. Caseworkers is a classic one. Now, of course, I'm the defensive former bureaucrat, but I've heard a lot of reports of interactions with an agency that sounded to the people that don't like bureaucracies, either on the left or the right, very plausible, that. But then when I really looked into it, well, the caseworker asked a simple question. Do you have the form? Can I see the form? What was your income? Those are part of the job they have to do. They could ask it as nicely as possible, and there still could be someone who could walk away from that and say I was treated in a rude or unpleasant way. So I caution you about that. Now the choice of ABODs. ABODs is a very specific group of SNAP recipients who have been the subject of lots of discussion, largely because the work requirement does exist, has been waived for large portions of the country for a long period of time. But the most important and interesting thing to them about them that's different than some of the other studies and also different from what we would be most see in the admin data is that they have no dependents. Households with children receive an enormous, or are able to receive, as Robert said, varieties of forms of assistance because we care about poor kids. Single individuals, childless adults with no dependents are not similarly attached to the safety net program. And so they're an interesting group that hasn't been looked at very carefully. And so I'm very happy that we're doing that. And why don't they work? This should be very, very useful. So one last thing. It's a piece of the puzzle. We have surveys, big surveys of big groups. I think they are showing increasingly to not be as reliable as they have been in the past. Bruce Meyer's work is really showing that very clearly. But they're still part of the puzzle. We have administrative data. I happen to think is very useful to look at what's really going on in households, what are the resources available to them. And I don't think that data is used as much as it should be and needs to be, so I'm glad that we're focusing on that. We have these ethnographic studies where we really talk to people. That's very, very important with the questions that I mentioned. I also should point out that there's another element of studies, or not, you can't really call them studies, but they're part of the discussion of low-income America, and that is often there's very good journalism. Just this weekend, 2 excellent stories, one in Financial Times, one in the New York Times, about what's happening with the opioid crisis, where doctors and people who are suffering from addiction are talking openly and honestly to journalists who've really done the hard journalistic work of tracking down information. That's extremely important. I should also point out that, this came up in our previous discussion before we came in, journalists are usually required to disclose the names of the people they're interviewing. That's part of the deal. Ethnographers and others can sometimes say we're going to use a pseudonym, and there's reasons for that, but I would say we ought to think about that a little bit because it does change the dynamic when one doesn't have to disclose their name. So journalism plays a role. And then finally, I'd like to just say there's one other element of gathering information, or another method of gathering information about what's happening in struggling households in the United States, and that is what you do when you're engaged in litigation. And this is a whole nother level of depth and maybe integrity. In the early 1960s, when the Civil Rights Division of the United States Justice Department had to bring cases concerning voting rights in the South, they could not use survey data. They could not use administrative data. They had to present hundreds and hundreds of witnesses who swore in court to the circumstances of their situation. And it was on both sides. African Americans who said, I applied to vote, I was denied my vote, but I answered all the questions correctly, and I'm here testifying under oath in a court proceeding. And then white Americans who came, who could barely read or speak a sentence, and yet during a literacy test of some sort, their voting application was approved. That required a standard of proof and evidence that is much different. I don't want to say higher, but it can be really compelling when it's done that way as well. And so I just, when we think about this, I'm very happy we're doing this. I think it's great, but I also want to caution that everything needs to be looked as sort of a piece of a very puzzle, and you need to use other sources of information as well.
Great. Thanks, Robert. Robert, do you want to comment a little bit about the focusing in on the SNAP recipients like ABOTs, how that fits into your work, where you see sort of the barriers there, and you also a note of caution like Robert Dorr did on where you see the pitfalls are maybe.
Sure. Well, one of the things, the disadvantages of ethnographic research, qualitative research, is that it takes a lot of time. You have to have researchers go in there. There's a leader of a team or co-leaders and a lot of field workers who go out there. It's very expensive. And because of that, you simply can't have sample sizes which are that large. The big ones are, 300 or 400 would be a huge, ethnography. And that's far below the sizes of our surveys, data sets, or sample sizes. So you're always worried about precision and whether you're randomly getting people. Now, really good ethnographies are completely aware of this, and they go out there and they make a serious attempt to get a distribution of people of different types, and it's all part of the design. Who do I want to talk to here? And the decision you face, given these constraints, is: do I want to go broad and get all kinds of different kinds of families, or then I won't get very many of each type? Or do I want to focus in? Okay, I recognize the limitations here. Let's do a light beam, in this group. And I think what Robert said was the ABOUTs have not really been studied by the ethnographies. It's not a group that most of the study of ethnographies are families with children or working class families that have dependents. It's just a different situation. And actually the number of childless adults is rising in the United States. Yeah. It's a very important group. I've done some work on it too, and a lot of them have very low income. It's very interesting. Men and women, not just single women. It's not just about men here. Yeah. And in fact, labor force participation rates of single men and women going down, just like it is for the average, as I mentioned before. So it's a very interesting group that's not been studied, and obvious for policy relevance for the SNAP. So to me, I just don't think we know very much about them, why they don't work. We have a lot of things in our head, kind of an image of that guy who was covered in the newspapers, some guy living on a beach in California. I've forgotten his name. He was very highly featured. But it's a very diverse group. And these guys just can't live on food stamps alone. I mean, obviously, you've got to pay for the clothing, you've got to pay for housing. Where are they getting their money? I mean, that's one thing is, if they're not working, they're getting either living with their family, and maybe they're not eating with them, because if you live with your family and eat with them, SNAP's going to count that income. So are they living alone? Are they how they have under the table income? Where are they? How are they paying the rent? How are they buying clothes? These are questions I don't think we have any ideas to answer to, and I don't think the surveys. You can go to the surveys and go to that sample and you ask people, what are your sources of income? Well, it's not going to be accurate. And a lot of it's unreported in administrative data. So that's why I think it's a pretty important group.
Great, thank you. We're going to open up for one or two questions before we turn to the next panel.
Over here. Yes, you certainly do.
Pete Kirstenhauser, Great Falls, Virginia. Last week, the Wall Street Journal published an article by two psychology professors about the replicability crisis in social science research. You're almost certainly familiar with John Ioannidis' landmark paper a dozen years ago about the problem of most published research findings are false. How would you replicate this? How would you either replicate it directly, or how would you replicate it through a different methodology to get the same result so that you get around this problem?
You want to, either of you want to take that? You're the academics. I have a comment on it, but you go ahead.
Well, first of all, my belief is that quantitative work and qualitative work should work together, and there should be a close interplay between them. Because of the reasons I mentioned for small sample size, I would never take a sample ethnography of 200 people and start making policy on the basis of that. You've got to find out if that's generalizable. You've got to go to a larger population of either survey or administrative data. You've got to do something to make sure you got it right. And that's hard, and because for the reasons I mentioned, the drawbacks. But to me, ethnographies, as a researcher, I read ethnographies for ideas and hypotheses, for explanations, and then that informs my quantitative work, which I hope is a form of going out and testing whether that's true on a representative sample and some kind of halfway replicability of the ethnographic work. I mean, I could say a lot more about replicability in general in the social sciences because there is a problem. A lot of that today is about different people using the same data and they get different answers or completely different answers to the same question using almost the same data. But that's a different issue we're talking about.
Yeah, my only comment would be that I look at it, as I said, as not definitive, but as part of a broad array of various forms of evidence that I gather in determining what the next step is or what the appropriate policy response is. I'm not looking for something that decides definitively what this study is going to say. And so I think it would be very hard to replicate a study of this kind in an exact way because it is so subjective. And just so long as you know that going in and you've thought about it, I think it makes it more reasonable. But the point is very well taken.
That's great, and we will get into some of that. I think Bruce is going to talk a little bit about that in the second panel. But also I think the hope with our project is that longer term, this would inform traditional surveys and try to get in some of the questions that we think are being missed in those surveys right now because we have an additional insight from ethnographic research. So it's possible to think of this as longer term than just this sample, we learned this, but using that information to advise policymakers that, look, this is a key thing that you're missing in current data, and maybe this is worth incorporating. Because the CPS is always sort of asking us, what else could we be talking about?
Another policy thing you can do is if a hypothesis comes up in an ethnography for why people are doing something, and maybe you do some quantitative work that seems to support it, our report has a little bit on experiments, okay? Well, go out. We're pretty sure this is the problem, okay? And this policy might address what we have identified as a very important barrier here. Well, let's run an experiment. We don't have time to talk about that in detail. It's in the report. A randomized trial. It's kind of the gold standard of causality. And does that policy solve it or not? And so it can lead to that, too. That's another avenue that's not replicability, but it's testing a policy.
Great. Okay, we have time for one more question, and then we'll jump straight to the second one.
Hi, I'm Laura Wheaton from the Urban Institute, and I was curious about ABOTs. Are you selecting them from areas in which the time limits have been reinstated, or areas that are still under waivers? Because there could be different characteristics in these two different areas. And I was also curious, since you're selecting them through the SNAP administrative, through SNAP, are they given assurances somehow that if they report information that might be out of compliance with what they've told SNAP, that they're protected?
I'm getting that question. So the goal was this group, and the task was to develop a relationship with a Department of Social Services either in Maryland or Virginia or the District of Columbia, that would allow us to access to their case file and then our ability to talk to those individuals. And I would prefer that we had both waiver places that are still or have been for a long time under waiver status and places that are not under waiver. So we get a little bit of both. The last question is, that's an interesting one. I think the assurance would be no, this will not affect their case status. On the other hand, the question you're raising is a very important one because, and I think everybody understood it, I hope everyone understood it. What I think you're saying, Laura, is that individuals may tell us things that they don't tell the agency and that the agency doesn't know that may make them ineligible for the benefit. And just the idea that you're suggesting that that could be true is revealing to me, because it definitely could be true. There's no question about it. But I would say that in order for any agency, if I was in the position of the agency, I would probably say, I don't want you we're going to say that what is disclosed to you cannot affect their eligibility. We have to find that out separately from some other source. But, we have to negotiate that. I mean, a little bit, just to be clear, we've not gotten the agreement of a SNAP program in any of these jurisdictions to do this. That is the next step.
Well, first of all, it has been done before. Catherine Eden did it once in one of her studies for Mathematica. I've forgotten which one it was. It was part of a program evaluation, and they used the SNAP administrative records as a sampling frame to draw the ethnographers. Jennifer can confirm this, but my understanding is it's all how you present yourself when you go in.
Yes.
I'm not from the government, okay? I'm from Johns Hopkins University. Although the joke around Baltimore, almost every family has been contacted by Johns Hopkins University, and they said, "Go away," But still, it's a matter of presenting yourself and then building up the trust over time that you're not from the government and you're not here to report things. Exactly. There are some reporting issues that come into ethnography. There are certain legal things actually you learn, like child abuse, that actually you're legally required to report. But it's all part of the building the trust about learning about information. But just using the records to identify them, where they are, their name and the records, and going out and just saying, "Here I am, I'd like to talk to you about your situation." I don't think that's an insurmountable problem.
Great. Let's take a 5-minute break before we head on to the second panel, where a lot of this, I'm sure, will come up again. But please join me in thanking our panelists.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Robert.
Okay,
yes.
Sure.
I have a lot of examples. Every time I do an interview today, I promise myself to never do anything.
Yeah, sure.
And then I go.
Right. Need a little bit of time away from
Takes me about
experience.
2 years
Yeah.
to recover. And I'm like, it's not about me. I know it's not about me.
Right. You're trying to convey a certain set of truths about what you
Yeah,
have.
that was true.
Yeah.
So,
Every time I would get home recovered and
yeah.
grief. It's like, what's with your life?
Right. So is he teaching a book now?
He is teaching.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Poor thing. He's had a hard time.
Yeah. Okay. Good.
I mean, he's a great teacher.
Yeah, I'm sure he is.
Has to
Right.
establish touch with his insane nature.
So that's the Stefanish then. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
He came to visit us in harrowing. But that was 2 years ago.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
But at Bucknell, if he had a different state, I think they would give him an transition.
Yeah.
Like they ask me all the time.
And is that a problem with Stefan then? Is that a state issue?
No, I mean, he has to finish this summer, but they've got it arranged because I think Stefan had a lot of. I think Stefan was really mad Aaron moved with me when we got married.
Stefan was what?
Mad that Aaron left and moved in when we got married to Lewisburg. Like, he wanted him to stay in Virginia. And we were like,
That's weird.
okay. It's actually much better for Aaron to not be away. So, and then when he started teaching, he was angry, Stefan was angry, but teaching was good too. Like,
Observed other people doing it.
I
I've
don't
learned
know,
a lot.
PA can be kind of a hard place to graduate with the team.
Yeah.
So,
Well, you got to keep an open mind.
but I think he's good,
what it is,
healthy,
how you do it,
excited about work.
what's
So
the best way.
my department made him take this fall off.
Modified.
So we'll just see what happens. I'm just like, whatever you want to do. Yeah.
Okay, good.
I know. Students like him.
No, I would imagine he's an engaging teacher.
Yeah, super engaging. Yeah.
Well, I think the hard thing about academia is, and of course this is like,
Very nice summary.
Probably, but you know, people have different gifts, and some people are really good teachers,
Yeah.
and some people are really good writers and researchers, and they're not always the same people.
Yeah.
You know?
I think Making Ends Meet illustrates
Some people are good at everything.
both strengths and
Are good at
weaknesses.
just one of these things.
Yeah, and you have to see it as like a whole. Where like we're all contributing differently.
That
And I do wish, like,
usually
the
you
conference
don't
UVA
have
has now
information built in
they
to
have
the questions
general faculty
to
are
essentially
really been
check
hired.
your answers.
We have people
Because
working in
there
our department
you
just
have
landed in system.
income and you have expenditures.
Reasons.
Now, my understanding
They're not kind of
is
intrinsic
that
to our department.
Kathy didn't
Right.
go through and make sure that they added up
Or
and
that are being
equaled
kept
each
their
other.
adjuncts
But she was
Anytime we
asking
have
about
some-
both.
something that's
So that forced
these
some
large
natural
courses in econ, they're really-
similarity between those two totals that you usually don't have in
That could be a bad thing as well as a good thing. You mean,
other universities.
yes,
forced
but
to add up, then
but-
they-
Is there something where
but it also my instinct is
Yeah,
that it
they're not going to
generally
be like, they're not going to be
forces
doing a lot in terms
people
of publications, but they're really going to
But
do
like
give a
at
more
Bucknell, you can
coherent
hear, like,
story
the
and corrects things.
Making it add.
But I think it's more
Most,
emotional
I'm
right
saying
now.
that most ethnographies don't have that
But I think
aspect.
he can do it.
So that was a strength of hers, and it's a weakness of most.
actually,
They don't do
That's
that.
right, they don't.
Right.
They don't.
We're
Hi,
not having
Laura.
dinner till 8. Just go work.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. We've been
So
emailing
you're basically
constantly, so.
confirmation my thesis.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Yes, yes, yes. Nice to
No,
see.
Aaron's like way smarter than me, but it gets him nowhere.
Yeah. We
With on the
right.
thesis.
Right. The structure. Yeah.
Yeah, do you think that will
So
be,
much fun.
you agree that's
His parents love it.
understudy?
Yeah. That's good.
Yeah.
But yeah, hopefully it'll be okay.
Yeah. Good.
You had the- Yeah. Oh, you did? Okay.
It's a good start.
That was a good
That
start.
and something else.
I think people are friendly a little outside of academia here. I like the
Oh,
normal.
we're very good.
I like this.
Yes, very nice.
Are people not friendly at like
Yeah.
other places you've been to? Like Harvard, for instance?
I found Harvard
I
quite
think
friendly.
most of them
Okay.
aren't eligible for Medicaid because they don't have kids.
I think of some of the talks I've given where people are
They're
just
active,
hostile.
allow students to
Yeah.
extend, I don't,
And of course,
Medicaid, so
econ.
they don't have that.
Econ talks
Economists are usually very scary. I gave a talk at MIT, the econ, and they were just like, why do you exist? Like, they could not.
Yeah, that's why it's
So if you
part
have,
is
if you
very
have
much
SNAP
uncommon.
and
So the idea that she was going to do this
Yeah.
is a good thing. It's sort of, you know, and
it's all administrative data? I mean, do you know
I mean,
anything
yeah.
about the kind of family they live in or how?
AI is such a nice place. It's given us an opportunity to really explore that field.
In SNAP records, at least they'll say what
So it's kind of great. But it also shows us may not have it all down. You know what I mean? We're not. So we're going at it. Go get them.
Go get him. I of course wrote mine out because I was like,
Okay, but Jen's going first, right?
yeah, Jen's
Okay.
going first.
Great, we're ready to start with our second panel. I hope you all got your coffee and are energized for this panel as well. We're going to start with Jennifer, and this panel focuses a lot on some of the stuff we heard before, on what are the problems we see with ethnographic research, what's the potential. Jennifer has done ethnographic research herself, and so I wanted to start off with her just to see her take on it. And then we'll have Bruce, who's been working with administrative data and sort of highlighting these gaps that we see in terms of recipiency and what people report. And then Brad can talk a little bit about his interest in the project and what he is hoping to learn from it and where he sees areas of caution. So Jennifer, I'm going to start with you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. So today I want to open with a story from my years conducting in-depth interviews when I was a postdoc working with Robert Putnam at the Harvard Kennedy School on his book, Our Kids, The American Dream in Crisis. So much of the evidence in Our Kids, if you've read it, consists of quantitative data that reveals growing class gaps in all kinds of predictors of success, like extracurricular activities, family structure, parental investments of time and money, and trust. And I remember when we were getting ready for the ethnographic piece of this research, we spent all these hours preparing interview questions about piano lessons, about whether people ate dinner with their families, about whether they went to church, and then I embarked across the United States. So in my very first interview, I meet Mary Sue, who was an 18-year-old who was living with her grandparents. And so we're having breakfast, and she first starts telling me about her parents' divorce when she was little. And she tells me her mother started stripping to pay the rent to feed her. Her dad remarried a woman who would hit her, not feed her, and put up baby gates to keep her confined. She was put in juvie when she was caught selling pot. She finished high school online. And then when I asked her about trust, she actually showed me burn scars she had on her arms from when someone she was hooking up with burned her in the middle of the night. And she tells me she hopes to take community college classes in the fall, even though she barely has a high school degree. But she's not sure if she can handle the pressure because of her PTSD. Sorry, everything I present is just dark and harrowing. And so Kristen Luker, the ethnographer, writes that sometimes you don't know what you're looking for until you're halfway through the data collection because what you're looking for doesn't even really have a name yet. And in this case, I remember, I'm sitting there. I quickly abandoned all of the initial interview questions because asking about piano lessons and family dinners just seemed completely absurd at this point. In fact, we couldn't even follow our initial research design where we were trying to talk to working class kids and their parents because so many of our working class kids were estranged from or didn't even know their dads. And so in this case, we went into the research I think that Bob wanted to confirm the quantitative data with some lively stories, but what we uncovered was this just much more complex story of trauma and distrust. So I would say that statistics they isolate individuals from their social environment. They often explain behavior using a language of prediction and quantification. That is essential. But people's accounts of the world provide crucial insight into the demographic patterns that we can observe through survey data. So I like to think about ethnography as helping us uncover the mechanisms that connect culture to behavior in ways that we just can't assume in advance. I would suggest, I think, that people's experiences of the world, even if we think they're untrue or even if we think they make no sense, can have a real impact on their actions and on their health and on their relationships because they act like they are true. And well-intentioned policies could then fail to reach populations. They could also fail to appeal to people if we're making assumptions about what motivates them that are just not the case. So I want to give another harrowing example from my own work. This is a book I've been working about disadvantaged people and how they understand politics. But I think it also gives us insights about how they understand family, work, and civic engagement. And these are all very crucial institutions for escaping poverty. So this is the story of Shelley Moore. She is a 33-year-old white woman. She is the granddaughter of a coal miner. And she lives in this declining mine town I spent 2 years in, where most of the mining jobs have been replaced by service jobs and education and healthcare. and retail that pay low wages and don't offer very good benefits. So Shelley tells me that her mom was just 13 when she was born, and her stepfather, who she describes as an angry truck driver, began abusing her when she was 4, and her mother refused to believe it. Sorry. So when she turned 18, Shelley swiftly married a boy from high school who was enlisting in the Army to get away, and she cut off all contact from her family. So then she tells me, she says, 6 years later, I got a phone call saying Mom died. Shelley explains, my mom friends told me, you know, your mom used to sit all day long waiting. As soon as her cell phone would go dead, she'd freak out. Shelley's going to call me one day. So Shelley pauses in our interview. She steels herself with a long, deep drag of a Newport menthol. And she says, I never called. I never called. That's when I spiraled into my heroin addiction. That's when I didn't care anymore. That's when life said, we're going to catch up with you. You called them out, but now you have to punish yourself, she says. And I did. I ripped my whole life apart because I couldn't cope. So today she's divorced, she's lost custody of her child, and she rarely leaves the house. So even when we met for coffee at Dunkin' Donuts, she could only stay for 3 minutes because of the crowd. We had to go back to her house. So then she tells me how she makes sense of what's happened to her. And you just can't make this up. She tells me there's a doctor on YouTube. He was talking about how he'd seen a magazine, and the article was called How Do Lobsters Grow? And it says that lobsters are soft, mushy creatures that live inside a tough shell. And when the lobster starts to grow, the shell doesn't expand. So the lobster starts to swell and starts to feel tight, starts to feel uncomfortable, starts to feel stress. So the lobster sheds the shell, grows a bit, produces a new shell, goes out into the world and deals with life. The doctor says if lobsters had doctors, they'd never grow. Because the moment the lobster would start to feel uncomfortable, the lobster would go to the doctor, they'd prescribe it this, prescribe it that. They'd never experience growth. And of course, I went into this thinking people would want more help. So Shelley cuts herself off from family members in her life who have caused her pain. She decides that depending on other people makes her weak, and isolation is the best way to survive. She rejects any kind of anti-poverty program or policy. She retreats inward, she disconnects herself from her larger community, and she watches YouTube. And instead of trying to address the causes of her suffering, she glorifies it. She makes it a central piece of her identity. Then turning serious, she builds this narrative bridge between her childhood experiences and her decision to disengage from politics. She says, putting your faith in one person is a lot. People have really messed with my trust. One of my biggest pet peeves is saying you're going to do something and you don't do that, because so many people have done that to me in life. She then treats this worldview as if it's true. She snuffs out the possibility of her own efficacy in ways that I think could have real consequences for her own future, for our economy, and for our democracy. And so if we wanted to design a social program that reached Shelley, I think we'd need to reach her in a way that resonated with this view of the world, and better understand how these cultural worldviews and social structures shape her behavior. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Jennifer. That was excellent.
So I think it's clear that there are many issues that you're not going to be able to get at any other way besides ethnography, as Jen has very eloquently gone through. I want to emphasize that more generally, when you're trying to learn about low-income populations, the best way is going to be to combine survey and administrative data. And I think of ethnography as a kind of survey, a very in-depth, focused survey. And it has the pluses and minuses of many surveys. Let me go to one example that I think Robert Moffat laid out quite well, and that was the work by Kathy Eden and Laura Lane, Making Ends Meet. And that illustrates both some of the strengths and weaknesses of ethnography. There, they were looking at the ways that low-income single mothers got by, different ways that they obtained money, obtained their income, and then also how they spent it. And because they were looking at both income and expenditures, that built in a natural check on the information that they got. So in not all ethnographies do you have that kind of check on the quality of the data. And that was a real strength of that work. I would also say that some of the things there can also be looked at in surveys, because you can look at expenditure data of low-income populations and see that they're spending more than their income, or at least what they report as their income, and you can learn a lot from that as well. Let me emphasize that, like other surveys, there's an issue of the quality of the data from ethnographies. And I'm going to first talk about surveys, in particular the flagship census surveys, the current population survey, and the survey of income and program participation. Those are the first survey, the CPS, is the one that we get our official poverty statistics from. The SIP is really the best census survey to look at low-income populations and the benefits they received. Now, when you compare what people report in those surveys to what the government paid out in administrative records, you see that a large share of people who are recipients of housing assistance, SNAP, public assistance, don't report that they're recipients. It's really quite an astonishing share. To cite a few statistics, 63% of those receiving public assistance, that's TANF or general assistance in the CPS, don't report it. And 44% of those receiving in the SIP don't report it. And you find similar statistics for SNAP, a little better for SNAP, but there are many categories of income that aren't reported well in these surveys. So the Census Bureau does a lot to check on the quality of the data and ensure the quality. They've been doing the CPS for 70 years, the SIP for 35 years. They do extensive field and cognitive testing of the questions. There's extensive professional training of the interviewers, many of whom have been doing interviews for years. They also send senior interviewers in to check, essentially in the case of the CPS, redo a share of the interviews as a check. Despite all these things, there still are enormous errors because low-income populations are hard to interview. People are busy, interviewers are busy, and there are substantial errors. So I don't think we should think that ethnographies are without error. We should be skeptical of the data from ethnographies, just like we should be of the data from surveys. And particularly when you're focusing on unusual situations, because there, if you're looking at an outlier, there's more of a chance that something important was missed, and that's why it looks like an outlier. As background for what I also want to say, let me mention that I'm working on a project that links survey and administrative data, which I think is really the way to go. And I'm going to talk about this project on Thursday. It's called the Comprehensive Income Dataset Project. And what we do is we link tax data, several Census Bureau surveys, and administrative data on program receipt from HHS, SSA, USDA, other federal agencies in the states, so that we can get a good picture of the low-income populations. And when we do that, we take this information and we compare it to what an ethnography got, in particular the $2 a day work by Schaefer and Eden. And we find that the administrative data combined with the survey data tell a very different story from what you would get from the ethnography. Now, we start from the quantitative component in that work, which should be applauded. This work, one very nice feature of it, it does combine a survey component with the ethnography. And we start from the same 392 survey households that Schaefer and Eden do, and we bring in administrative and survey data. And in the end, we can't find any of them to be living on less than $2 a day. This is an example of a gulf between what an ethnography found and what you can see in combination of other administrative and survey data, which I find troubling. Now, in truth, I think in the book, the $2 a day standard was a bit of an over-dramatization. And if you look in the details of the descriptions, many of the households really weren't getting by on that little income in the description, but that's maybe in part just how it was sold. What do I think is a good way going forward to understand the barriers that low-income populations face? I think what's being proposed in this ethnography project is a good idea, a very good idea. Another option is to take all of these administrative records that I've described and combine them with detailed survey information from the Survey of Income and Program Participation, which is what I'm in the process of doing. And there you have a fair amount of information on the barriers that households face, including all kinds of hardships like inability to pay electrical bills or the rent. You have information on education, disability, housing problems, schooling, veteran status. You have more limited information on things like job displacement and drug and alcohol abuse. But I think that also is a complementary way of getting at the barriers that low-income populations face. Now, one final thing, in doing what I described, linking the survey and administrative data that we have access to, one group that stood out as not having income that we could find in either the survey or the administrative data, one group that was we couldn't verify as not having substantial, really disadvantaged people, was the single individuals, single households. And that is the group that I think the plan is to focus on, and I think that that's a really good choice. So let me stop there.
Thanks, Bruce.
So I think it's the case that good ethnography is needed now in some ways more than ever. Ethnography that allows us to kind of get behind the numbers that we see in our surveys and understand how and why our social fabric is changing. And I'm particularly interested kind of in what's happening to families and to relationships in American life. And what we're seeing is that there are some important ways in which family life is changing from just the perspective of sort of the quantitative side, of the survey side. We don't really know precisely how it's changing and why it's changing. And this is where ethnography can kind of, I think, play an important role in helping us to kind of catch up in interpreting, in understanding what's happening to American families and American relationships. So let me give you kind of just three examples of areas where I think ethnography could be of enormous service to us. And then I think the fourth sort of area would be kind of in the sort of topic that you just touched on a second ago, Bruce, in terms of looking at these single adults without kids as a sort of fourth area. But we're tackling that in this particular project. I want to talk about three different trends that I think are also happening that we don't really understand yet and that we need to understand. So the first thing I want to mention is that from the 1960s to about 2008, we saw the share of kids born outside of marriage going up and up and up and up. Okay? But in 2008, as the Great Recession hits, the share of kids born outside of marriage, for the first time, obviously, in many, many years, ticks downward. And if you look at sort of trends in marital fertility, look at trends in non-marital fertility, as a piece by Angela Rashid is going to be covering in a few days, what you see is that there's been a decline since the recession, a little bit in marital fertility. There's been a dramatic decline in non-marital fertility since the recession. And that decline has been really concentrated among Hispanic and African American and less educated white women. So, something is really changing right now in American life when it comes to sort of fertility and childbearing. And we estimate in our work that sort of basically 4 million babies since the recession hit have, not happened, if you will. And so the point I'm making here is that I think we need it might be called a kind of a new book. Maybe we'd call it Pregnancy Postponed or something. That would be kind of the successor book to Kathy Eden Marie Cafalos' book, Of Course Promises I Can Keep, Why Poor Men Put Motherhood Before Marriage. Because what's happening today is that there are a lot of young women in that very same demographic that they focused on, a while back, who are not, putting marriage before mother, or at least not putting marriage in their teens and 20s. And we need to understand why this is happening. Is it because work is increasingly precarious, either in their lives or in the lives of their, the men in their lives? Is it because something has shifted in the popular culture? Is it because they're the first generation to kind of come of age in the wake of welfare reform? And that sort of the fact that there is much less AFDC or TANF, and there's cash welfare is much harder to access now than it was, say, 30 years ago. Is that part of what's happening here? We don't know. And so what I'm sort of suggesting is that we really need sort of new ethnographic research to kind of cover the very territory, the very terrain that Eden Cafalos covered, to sort of figure out what's happening in this important area of American family life and, of course, social policy as well. The second thing that I think is worth thinking about is just to think about why it is that there are, indications, both in the GSS and in work done by the CDC, that sex is down in America, that fewer Americans are having sex either kind of on a regular basis or they're not having sex at all. So, for instance, my own analysis of the GSS indicates that the share of 18 to 30-year-olds who are reporting no sex in the previous year rose from 12% in the early 2000s to 18% in 2016. Likewise, the CDC reports that teenage sex is down from 47% in 2005 to 41% in 2015. Now, you might think that's good news, you might think that's bad news, but it's certainly interesting news. Something is sort of, I think, changing when it comes to sort of sex and relationships in American life today. And again, we don't really know why it's changing. I have some thoughts about the rise of screen culture, the way in which these devices can encourage social media, gaming, maybe pornography in ways that kind of inhibit real person socialization, real person dating, marriage, and of course sex. There could be ways too in which kind of the implications of kind of Me Too will affect sexuality among young adults and adults more generally. There could be ways in which changing gender conventions are, changing people's approach to sex. But my point simply is that there is this sort of change that we can see kind of happening in these surveys when it comes to sex in America, and we don't yet understand why it's happening. And that's what we need, I think, good ethnography to do. And the final point I wanted to make is just that we're also seeing, and this is based in part on work by Robert Moffat, who just preceded me on this panel, that American means-tested programs and policies are increasingly targeting and serving Americans who are kind of near the poverty level or just above the poverty level. In other words, more and more sort of working class and lower middle class families are being served by and participating in American welfare programs and policies, from things like SNAP to Medicaid to the EITC. And in fact, some work that I've done with some colleagues suggests that more than 40% of American families today are receiving some kind of means-tested tax or transfer program or policy. We know too that about 1 in 2 babies, almost 1 in 2 babies, are being born today with some kind of assistance from Medicaid. So the point here is that a very large share of American families are being touched by these programs and policies, and it's not just sort of the poor; it's also the working class and lower middle class. And we don't really know kind of how people in the working class and in the lower middle class are sort of experiencing these programs, and how they're affecting their thinking about things like work and marriage. So I think we also need new ethnographic research sort of to figure out kind of how these programs are being utilized, how they're being experienced, and how they're shaping decisions about work and marriage, among other things. Because again, they're playing a much more important role practically in the lives of the working class and the lower middle class today than they would have done, say, 30 or 40 years ago. So those are 3 areas where I think ethnography kind of needs to move to help us to understand some important changes in American family life and relationships that we're seeing play out in recent years in the U.S. in our surveys.
Great, thank you, Brad. I just wanted to start off on a quick question for Jennifer. One interesting thing that you sort of talked about was how people were cutting themselves off from anti-poverty programs, the example that you mentioned. So if you could elaborate on that, and also just, generally where you see the pitfalls in ethnographic research, having done some of it yourself.
Sure, I have a whole list of problems I've had. So I think this is the larger point is that I feel like every time I've gone out to do an ethnographic study, I had a lot of ideas of what I should ask and what I should find, and they're always wrong. Which is very stressful, but also helps us learn a lot. Like my first project, I called it Dreams Deferred, because I thought people would be really sad that their dreams are not coming true, and then they told me they had no dreams. So, it's just you have to be kind of open and flexible as you're doing the work. One of my larger, and this is sort of coming out of my work with Putnam, was, I've been working on this project of working class political disengagement, and sort of thinking about how the institutions that might have connected poor and working class people, like churches and marriage and unions, up to politics, are pretty weak right now. And one of the things I found instead is that people who were suffering, like Shelley Moore, all of her family struggles and her money struggles, were sort of turning inward. They were so distrustful of everyone around them, beginning with their own families and moving up to institutions, that they decided that it was almost a virtue to be isolated and try to be self-reliant and withdraw totally from other people. And that was actually one of the largest themes of this new book I'm writing, was this inward-focused turn. On top of that, let's see, in terms of some problems, I think access is a large problem. So I was in this coal mining town for a few years where many people stay inside all day. They have the doors locked. They have the screens drawn of the windows. And if you were to knock on the door, they wouldn't open it or they'd slam it in your face. Part of this was exacerbated by the heroin epidemic, where the police have been using confidential informants to try to find drug dealers. And so I kept being asked if I was a cop. That was made worse by the fact that ethnographers call out the people we talk to informants. So, it was just a disaster. It takes a really long time to build trust, and I sort of had to be known as this person's friend, or, oh, this person vouched for you, in order to get in. But that did allow me to reach populations that I think would be impossible to reach other ways because of their distrust. But it does take a lot of resources and a lot of time and energy to do this kind of work. I think it's important that you are not verifying what you want to find, but you are instead trying to uncover new knowledge. But that just happens kind of on its own when, I had a whole series of questions about politics and people just telling me, I don't care, I don't care, I don't care. And, I said, okay, what do you want to talk about? And I'd shift the conversation. So I think just being able to do that can also help a lot. And I think, like we were talking about replicability, I just think you have to be very, very clear about exactly who your population is and who you're talking to. So I do use pseudonyms. I don't think my university would let me not use them. But at least I can be like extremely clear about like the income, race, gender, type of job, like as clear as I can about who I'm talking to and where, so that other people might be able to then try to replicate the study. And then also just sort of knowing the limits of what you can say. And like as many people have said, just if I can uncover new mechanisms for understanding, maybe family trauma as a mechanism for disengagement from politics, I think that could be studied in surveys or could be studied over time. So those are my main ones. Oh, and the issue of truthfulness, where I try to verify things. So I was in a town where everyone kept telling me that the doctor would prescribe opiates for $25 over the phone. And that seemed really suspect. And then he was arrested, and he was like the largest opiate prescriber in the state. So like that was something I could verify. Other things, like many men told me that 9/11 didn't happen and that fluoride was in the water for mind control. So like that is obviously not true, but it also tells us a lot about how they see the world and how distrustful they are. So I think there's sort of a balance between truth and understanding people's perceptions of the world.
Great, thank you. We have time for a few quick questions. Does anybody want to go first?
I have a question for Jen, or for all three of you. In poverty alleviation efforts, there's the issues of what the system can do, the economy, the public assistance programs, caseworkers, employers. And then there's the issue of the potential and assets, human capital, of individuals in need. And I'm just wondering, how do you think about that, Jen, or any of you, about, I mean, some of what you were describing, Jen, was kind of a portrait of, I don't want to say that sound harsh, but a portrait of dysfunction. Is that even if you had really capable caseworkers and a wonderful economy and employers that paid more, are you a little worried that the story you portray is so hopeless that maybe it doesn't matter how good the system is, there's a real human capital weakness? I just do you ever concern about?
But one of my book reviewers was like worried I'd become like deeply depressed from my work, and this is how I saw the world. But well, I mean, I think I would say it's definitely a story of distrust and a story of betrayal. But I think I do also. These people do end up opening up to me, and they end up trusting me when I put enough time into it and put enough time into listening to them. And there are instances like through churches or from drug addiction support groups where people actually do start helping each other. They're just very scarce, and so in my research, there are spaces that kind of patch up all of the brokenness or dysfunction or chaos, but they're just very scarce. And I think one of the things that comes out of my research is the need for more of these. Like you have to pull people back in and show them that they can trust larger systems, I think.
Bruce or Brad, did you want to comment on that?
I don't have
Yeah, we have a question. Oh.
Hi, Noah Duell. I work here at AEI. I had a question for Jen. You had a quote here that I wrote down that which really stood out to me. It says, statistics isolate individuals from their social environments. And my question is, how does your work capture the nuance, the differences in individual cases where you have to, at the end, make broader conclusions about a populace as a whole?
I try to be careful about making broader conclusions about a whole. So I like to see myself as sort of working with, demographers. So, for example, like Robert Putnam has great statistics about working class youth withdrawing from civic and political life over several generations. So not voting, not joining any organizations, not going to church. And so I sort of like kind of take that as this broader puzzle, and then I think my work can come in and say why and how that is happening. And so, some of the things I come up with are feelings of distrust and betrayal by institutions and a lot of family trauma. And then I almost wish I want to give those back to the demographers and say, okay, can you go see if you can figure out if this is going on? I have sort of a broad range of working class people. Maybe it's only happening in like one part of the working class and not another, or maybe it's not happening in cities and it's happening in rural places. I feel like that's for future research. So I really, I love demographers because they can give me puzzles to solve. And then I think they like my work because I can help them answer, when I have no idea why they're seeing relationships.
Great. One last question, or let's just combine. I think we had one there and one. Okay. Thank you.
So this is just Vanessa, and I'm with Cato Institute. Kind of a basic question, but what are the participants' incentives? So why is it that they are willing to talk to you? What's in it for them? And why are they interested in sharing all of this personal information with you?
I've done different kinds of projects. So for my dissertation, which became my first book, I had zero money, so I had no incentives. So I literally would just go out. I was studying working class young adults, and I would go to community colleges and Walmart and every kind of workplace you can imagine, daycares, and I would just be like, hi, my name is Jen, I'm doing this project, can you help me? I'd really like to hear your story. And only one or two people said no. And a big part of it for them was that they felt like no one else was listening to them. It was almost like therapy, I think, for them, where they just had time to talk and share and cry and tell me things that they couldn't tell other people. It was really stressful in a way because I feared rejection all the time, but then people were pretty responsive. I think it helps. I think it helps if the ethnographer can be sort of friendly and seems trustworthy and open. When I worked with Bob Putnam, and in my later book, we were able to offer cash incentives, and that just made my job a little bit easier. And then but sometimes it also provided insight. So there was one family I remember that had to arrange a funeral for a family member who was killed in a gang fight, and that $50 ended up being used for the funeral. And so we could kind of take that and also use it to understand where people needed money.
Bruce, I'm just wondering if you could comment on how it works with traditional sort of household surveys, why there is more reporting there, or is it different?
It's interesting that Jen said that people wanted to tell their story, that they felt that no one was listening to them. And I think with most government surveys these days, people probably feel like they're over-surveyed, that so many people are asking them questions. When they go see a doctor, they get a survey. When they buy something online, they get a survey. When they bring their car in to be repaired, they get a survey. So, it's a different kind of survey, and Jen's obviously more sympathetic and is going to be more interesting to talk to, I suspect, than typical census interviewer who has a script that they have to follow. But I found her answer to be very interesting because I think that in the old days, when a census interviewer came to knock on your door, it really was that experience that you had someone that you could tell your story to. But now I think people have so many opportunities. If they want to reveal personal details about themselves, they can put it on Facebook. So I don't think traditional surveys get quite that reception these days.
I also had several people think I was an assistant to a professor and want to help me get my job done. So there's like a lot of different ways of harnessing that. Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much to all of you for being here, and please join me in thanking our panelists. And this was a really interesting and wonderful discussion, and we'll keep you posted as our project moves forward. Thank you.